Tonight, we won't march into battles or crown halls. We'll walk into a place that no longer exists, yet refuses to leave the world entirely. A place built to hold every thought ever written, and perhaps a few that were never meant to be. They called it the Library of Alexandria, though the name alone hides more than it tells. Was it a sanctuary for all knowledge, or a vault where secrets slept under lock and wax? Some say it housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, others say less. And a few whisper that the most important works were never counted at all. What we know is this: one day, it was here. And then, without warning, it wasn't. Tonight, we'll wander those imagined corridors together. We'll hear the papyrus rustle where the sea air still lingers, feel the weight of words pressed into ink 2,000 years ago, and listen for the moment when silence arrived and never left. So dim the lights, settle into the kind of stillness where even paper seems to breathe. And if you feel your pulse slow, that's just the past drawing you in. If quiet mysteries like this keep you close, you might consider subscribing. And if you share your time and place in the comments, perhaps the next story will find its way to you. The idea started like so many ideas in the Hellenistic world. A king got bored. Ptolemy I, former general of Alexander, sat in a city that smelled of salt and warm bread and fish scales, and decided the only thing missing was a universal memory. He did not call it that. He called it a Mousian, a place of the muses, the 9 sisters who, in Greek imagination, are responsible for both epic poems and suspiciously long footnotes. He brought in a policy man, Demetrius of Phalerum, who understood that big dreams require boring tools. So they designed catalogs. They ordered storage jars and scroll bins, and a shade arbor for the scholar's courtyard. Because research goes better when nobody is squinting, they hired people who could read in 2 languages before breakfast and copy in 3 before dinner. There's a nice rumor that the king paid them in barley rations measured by the stichos, a line of text of conventional length. It is the kind of rumor that feels true simply because it is so politely dull. Alexandria itself was a port that moved like a chess. Inhale, the ships arrived with wine and timber and pepper, and passengers who had never seen streets laid out like a chessboard. Exhale, the ships left with grain and stories about a building where people ate together under pergolas and argued quietly about accents. The city had 2 harbors, the Great Harbor for serious trade and the Eusnostos Harbor for repairs and gossip. Between them stood the Pharos, the lighthouse with a mirrored fire, just the sort of visual metaphor a library loves. Ptolemy's people posted a standing order at the customs houses. Any scrolls entering the city had to be borrowed, copied by neat hands and returned, except that the originals were kept and the copies returned instead. This is not what we would call a borrowing policy today, but the notice was written cleanly, the ink lines measured, and the practice filed under an appealing title from the ships. If you squint, you can almost see a clerk stamping that phrase on a slip with the same satisfaction one feels when a kitchen drawer finally closes on the first try. The Mousian grew a daughter, the Serapeum, when shelf space ran out. Moving books due to lack of room is an ancient tradition. Scholars pretended to miss the old building while secretly enjoying the new one's better light. The philosopher who directed the place, one of many named like an entire verse of Greek, walked the colonnades, counting steps because counting transforms anxiety into geometry. Eratosthenes measured the earth with 2 wells and some shadow, then ate a fig and returned to a diagram that needed a longer caption. Callimachus compiled the Pineaches, a catalog so big it was practically a landscape. He listed authors, titles, opening words, subjects, and sometimes cranky little notes, like a librarian who has seen 1 too many copies of a popular saga with the same missing page. The catalog itself became a sort of book about books that probably needed its own book to explain it. That is how you know you have a proper research institution. Nothing is simple, and everything is filed anyway. Now the scrolls. A scroll is a conversation with time that asks the reader to turn, not just look. Papyrus was the chosen technology, a plant that pretends to be paper if you persuade it gently. Workers sliced the stalk into long wet ribbons, laid them crosswise, pressed them with stones, and smoothed them with shells. The layers held together with the help of a glutinous paste, which ancient manuals describe in reassuringly plain language, as if a recipe for soup. Drying was done in shade because the sun is impatient and makes pages brittle, the way a toaster makes bread enthusiastic. After curing, sheets were joined edge to edge with a wheat starch glue that, to this day, makes conservators smile a little. Not because it is interesting, but because it usually behaves. A roll might be 10 meters long if the scribe was confident or very caffeinated. More often, it was shorter because human arms are not reals. Writing used a reed pen cut to a chisel tip, and the ink, a soft carbon black, was stored as a solid and licked awake with water, which is the same relationship I have with tea. The best scribes wrote straight without lines. Others drew guide marks that later were scraped off with a bit of pumice. At the end, the copyist often added a colophon, a small confession at the tail of the text, copied by so-and-so, in the reign of the such and such. From a good exemplar, in bad weather, with a cramped hand, please forgive mistakes. Sometimes there is a wish for health. Sometimes a complaint about the thickness of the papyrus, which is the ancient version of telling your printer it is on thin ice. When rolls were stored, they were tied with a linen thong and slipped into pigeonhole shelves. The label, the silly little title tag, hung like a bookmark that never learned to lie flat. What filled those rolls was astonishingly ordinary and also sometimes astonishing. Tax lists lived next to tragedies. Recipes sat beside mathematics. There were astronomical almanacs that warned farmers when to expect a dusty moon, and philosophical treatises that warn nobody about anything practical, which is the point of philosophy when done carefully. The library chased down Homeric variants with the zeal of someone trying to identify a plant by its leaves, and it preserved medical case notes that relished pulse rates with the tenderness of someone counting a friend's breaths. One day, the staff acquired a shipment of plays attributed to Euripides that were almost certainly not by Euripides. They shelved them anyway and made a note. The note is the important part. The library acquired copies of letters by Archimedes and at least one treatise by Aristarchus suggesting the sun sits still and the earth moves. One suspects the scroll lay quietly because the night sky continued to look busy. Between famous names, there was the practical matter of getting through winter. Instructional scrolls advised readers not to store figs with sour wine. Another advocated cedar oil to deter bookworms, which are not worms and do not read, but do understand nibbling. All of this, piled up like calm waves, brings us to the part everyone tries to light with dramatic flame. The first blaze, the rumor goes, came during Julius Caesar's visit, when his ships caught fire and their flames marched up the harbor to warehouses full of books from the ships. The story varies like music played on a slow instrument. Some say the main library burned, others that only the port depots suffered, a library annex with the pleasant smell of cedar and patience. Caesar mentions the fire but not the scrolls. Later writers mention the scrolls but not the specific buildings. It is precisely the sort of evidentiary soup historians enjoy sipping at conferences just before they give in and yawn. The safest statement is so gentle it almost falls asleep halfway through. The city burned at least once in ways that probably inconvenience reading. When people say the burning of the library, they usually mean the long, thoughtful decline. A change of rulers, a budget adjusted by other priorities, a few broken doors, rain sneaking in, readers migrating to warmer rooms. The Mausian becoming a memory, even as it kept breathing through the Serapeum, its daughter. The Serapeum itself was a temple complex with shade and stairs, and a storage gallery where rolls might have waited like cats in sun stripes. Then, in the late 4th century, a wave of religious enthusiasm and imperial edicts against pagan temples folded over the city. The Serapeum was attacked. Statues toppled and shelves groaned, and what exactly happened to the stored texts dissolves into dust motes of testimony. You can hold your breath and listen to the silence between lines in the historians Socrates and Rufinus, and hear the sound of someone not quite remembering a room they left too quickly. Centuries later, another story wandered in carrying a tray of tea and a riddle. During the Arab conquest, a commander supposedly ordered the remaining books burned to heat the city's baths, on the theory that if the writings agreed with scripture, they were superfluous, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. Scholars now file this anecdote under late and implausible, with a small note: good theater, weak citation. What likely persisted after the 4th century were smaller collections, personal libraries, textbook cabinets. Alexandria kept reading because Alexandria kept breathing. The past very rarely stops like a lamp switched off. It dims, hesitates, rummages for a candle. The library lives on more solidly in the things that escaped. The Oxyrhynchus papyri, hundreds of kilometers away, preserved by dry Egyptian rubbish mounds, give us fragments of plays and receipts and letters that look, frankly, exactly like the sort of backup copies a prudent person keeps in their second desk drawer. Galen, the physician who wrote more than anyone has time to read, complains in one essay about the old from the ship's policy at Alexandria, which tells us he read the notice and experienced the same resigned admiration that all borrowers feel when a library has thought of everything. Callimachus' catalogs survive only in shreds and quotations, like recipes remembered by relatives who disagree about the seasoning. Yet the structure glows. Genres nested within genres, authors placed like careful chess pieces, opening lines acting as keys. I like to imagine the catalog scribes keeping their own catalog of the catalog, and a private list of favored titles that, human nature being what it is, included a comic poem with bad puns. What would we have had if the shelves had lasted? Here the mind becomes a gentle balloon. Maybe complete tragedies that now end mid-sentence, where King is halfway through admitting he should have listened. Maybe an alternate proof of something Euclid proved, but with a little drawing of a donkey in the margin because the scribe got bored. Maybe a lost travelogue describing monsoon winds with the attitude of someone who hates being damp. Perhaps even more carefully drawn star charts, where the long-tailed visitor we call a comet is recorded as both a sign and irritation too. Astrologers whose predictions suddenly needed footnotes. The charm of the library is not that it held the answer to everything. It is that it stored the practice of answering, the daily habit of writing things down, so they would not have to be kept in the head, leaving room for breakfast. In our own time, the ghost of the place holds meetings. It is there when an archivist labels a hard drive, "Master do not touch," knowing the label is an invitation. It is there when a graduate student spends an afternoon learning the difference between a text witness and a text tradition and comes away with a headache and a deepening love for neat sigla. The modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a swooping disk of a building, was placed by the sea like a deliberate echo. Its reading rooms are full of light. People take pictures of the wall engraved with scripts from around the world, and then, because memory is modern now, they upload the pictures to backup services that are themselves backup services of backup services. I am not sure immortality exists, but redundancy certainly does. The softest fact of all is that libraries almost never finish. Even when the building ends, the idea tends to leak into other rooms. A medieval scribe in a cold monastery copied a page of Aristotle from a page scraped clean of another Aristotle, the faint ghost letters still visible beneath. That is a very library thing to do. Renaissance humanists wrote letters to each other asking after codices, the way neighbors ask after missing baking pans. An 18th century collector bought a trunk of papyri charred by Vesuvius and proceeded to unroll them as patiently as one unrolls a spring scarf, which went poorly at first and then slightly better because persistence like paste improves with age. Every attempt to reconstruct the catalog of Alexandria is itself a catalog entry in a larger catalog of attempts. If you're still with me, let your attention drift down to the small mechanics. Imagine the sound of a reed nib making its first cautious diagonal stroke of the day. Imagine a librarian's table with a shallow bowl of wheat paste, a brush, a bone folder polished by 100 hands, and a stack of new papyrus sheets that smell faintly, unexpectedly, of green rivers. Imagine someone testing a fresh roll by unspooling precisely 7 turns, then rewinding 2. A habit acquired from a teacher who believed that grace lives in small reversals. Picture a scholar standing in the courtyard, counting paces between columns to time a recitation because a good sentence often knows its own length. None of these details matter very much. All of them matter exactly enough. It is tempting to be heroic about loss, to declare that if only the library had survived, we would be commuting to Mars on lunch breaks and prescribing Play-Doh for headaches. That is most likely untrue. Knowledge tends to find a way, like ivy that decides a wall is an opportunity. Yet it is also possible that we lost a handful of shortcuts, a few recipes for thinking that would have saved later thinkers a season or 2 of trial. I like imagining a treatise on practical surveying that removed an awkward century from the history of flood control, or a comedy so well crafted that a dozen later playwrights quietly learned timing from it without ever knowing they were descendants. When we whisper the name of the library now, we are actually whispering 2 names, the building that was and the habit that continues. Somewhere in a quiet climate-controlled room, a conservator repairs a tear with a strip of Japanese paper and a speck of paste, and the gesture would have made sense to a person in Alexandria 2,000 years ago. Somewhere else, someone sits with a digital scan of a faint Greek text and adjusts the contrast until the ink comes back like a ship at dusk. And in countless houses, people label folders with careful, counterproductive labels like MISC, important, which is honestly the most Alexandrian label of them all. So let the argument about how many scrolls there were hum like a far engine. Let the figures waver kindly. They are doing their best. What remains is the picture of a city that wanted to remember more than any one person could hold. A city that posted its curiosity at the customs house and made the world declare what it knew. The library that vanished did not vanish neatly. It trailed off the way a conversation trails off when both people are content to sit beside each other and listen to the harbor. Paper, ink, reed, paste, catalog, colophon, cupboard, key. The words themselves are already sleepy. The sea breathes in. The sea breathes out. Somewhere a clerk writes, "From the ships," on a tidy slip and sets it in a tray, and if that tray is still in use, it is only because we keep finding more ways to say what we mean and more gentle places to keep it while we rest. You might not expect a tax to be counted with a ladder, a notebook, and a pair of very sensible shoes, but that is how the window tax went about its quiet business for more than a century. People tend to imagine taxes as numbers on parchment. The window tax was numbers on walls. A clerk stood in the street, looked up at your house, and counted the holes where daylight entered. It was an accountant's version of stargazing. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part about dormer exceptions and the quarrel over cellar gratings, feel free to subscribe, or just let your eyes close like shutters and pretend you did. I will keep counting softly until the town fades into evening. It began in the chill of the late 17th century when governments were short of money and long on war's coins, were clipped thin as autumn leaves, and fresh ideas were regarded with the respectful suspicion reserved for new kinds of soup. Attacks on windows, the ministers reasoned, would be difficult to hide and simple to measure. Windows are public creatures. They stand on the face of a house the way freckles sit on a cheek. A collector doesn't need to step inside or negotiate with watchdogs or make polite remarks about the state of the floors. He needs only a pair of eyes and ideally a hat. The rates changed often, as rates do when parliaments get bored. Sometimes there was a threshold pay nothing if your house looked modestly blind, a little if it squinted, rather more if it threw luminous glances at the street. Sometimes the levy was by bands, sometimes by pains, sometimes by a logic that makes sense only in committee rooms after lunch. The guiding principle was wonderfully ordinary: more light, more tax. Houses learn to blink. In towns, you can still see the eyelids bricked up rectangles where a window once daydreamed. Some are neat, as if a mason ironed the wall. Some are messy and look like a bandage applied by a relative. These blind windows are the shy monuments of fiscal policy. Architects became poets of pretense. A false window might be painted on to keep the facade symmetrical, because symmetry, like tea, comforts even when slightly silly. In some places, the taxman counted openings that were blocked with glass, but never cut through. In others, he ignored paint entirely, the way a cat ignores your heartfelt speech. Regulations wandered between parishes like visiting cousins, similar but not the same. There were arguments about whether a little stairwell slit counted as a window or an apology. There were notes about skylights that never saw the sky. There were official statements on the status of shop shutters, which sounds thrilling until you read them and feel your pulse settle into a very even line. The inspectors themselves were ordinary men with a talent for counting while being shouted at politely. They carried staves for balance and authority, and they learned to read buildings like faces. They knew when a bricked rectangle suggested a fresh avoidance, and when it was old news. They were suspicious of ivy. They were very suspicious of plaster that looked smug. Some developed the enviable skill of counting while walking, without tripping over a milk pail. Their notebooks were small, their pencils were practical, and their handwriting, if one judges by surviving examples, was the kind of patient script that thinks about bread. At year's end, clerks added the numbers by candlelight, chewing their quills as if arithmetic had flavor. People adapted without drama. In crowded streets built long before the tax, windows were a luxury and a necessity. Light for reading the price on a loaf, air to help soup decide to simmer. When the rates went up, some families kept the kitchen bright and the spare rooms dim, as if teaching daylight to be thrifty. Landlords argued with tenants who prized their view of the neighboring roof. Tenants argued back with unusual expertise in counting. Housewives learned which sashes could be spared and which made laundry bearable. Builders grew clever with borrowed daylight, transoms that coaxed sunshine through hallways, glazed fanlights that smuggled the afternoon above a door, internal borrowed light panels set high like a polite secret. In certain winters, you could tell who had bricked a window recently, because the mortar looked younger than its neighbors, the way a patch on a well-loved coat announces both care and compromise. The myth that this policy created the phrase daylight robbery wanders cheerfully through guidebooks and pub conversations, and it is a very good phrase, but older than the tax and indebted to other complaints. Still, even historians who wave the myth away will admit, with the cautious smile of people who like footnotes, that the tax did teach households to ration brightness. There were also exemptions that show the taxman had something like a bedside manner. Poor houses were often excused. Hospitals made their case with the confidence of institutions that no ventilation beats accountancy. Schools petitioned too, because children are better behaved when classrooms can see their own chalk. Churches argued successfully that stained glass should not be counted because it was more sermon than sunlight. Because revenue loves company, other countries tried versions of the same idea. On the other side of the channel, after a changeable decade or two, France settled into a long affair with taxes on doors and windows. It lasted so long that city plans themselves grew cautious. Narrow alleys cultivated modest facades. Rural houses tucked their light under eaves and pretended to be smaller than they felt. Elsewhere, the idea appeared and faded like a fashion for a hat brim, sometimes returning shorter, sometimes larger, always useful to sketch writers looking to fill a column with humor about bureaucrats who carry measuring sticks. The rulebooks multiplied serene details. What counted as a window? Not a ventilation hole if it had no frame, unless it did. Not a church oculus if sacred, unless the parish ledger said otherwise. Dormers were generally windows because roof light is still light, but the exact geometry could derail a meeting for a gratifying 40 minutes. Garden conservatories were counted when attached, ignored when not, a distinction that turned on whether a plant felt like a resident. Cellar grates were debated into a kind of gentle philosophy. If a grate admitted a scrap of day, and a man could squeeze through, perhaps it was a door. If not, and a cat could, but not with dignity, perhaps it was a window. Many decisions ended with the helpful phrase, "to the satisfaction of the collector," which is a bureaucratic lullaby meaning, use your best judgment and write tidily. All this counting produced the curious geography of blind windows we walk past now. Some were later reopened when the levee vanished. Others remained blocked because custom, once built, is sturdy. In Georgian terraces, you find perfect rhythm window, pretend window like a polite waltz. In coastal towns, where wind does arithmetic of its own, owners discovered that a bricked window gave less trouble than a taxed one that rattled. You can learn a neighborhood's personality by its decisions. Merchants loved light and paid for it. Lawyers sighed and negotiated with it. Apothecaries fetched sunshine almost greedily and then wrote it off as health. Medical people did, in fact, mutter about the consequences. Air was a medicine before medicine had many drugs, and light a cheery nurse. There were pamphlets with titles like On the Necessity of Free Ventilation in the Abodes of the Industrious, which is the 18th century way of saying open a window. When a fever visited a dark street, reformers would stand below dim sashes and deliver speeches to the bricks about the value of daylight. The bricks remained neutral. The people inside listened, decided, and sometimes, after a conversation with a local inspector and the household purse, broke through an old blind to let the afternoon back in with the gentle thud of fresh mortar and a sigh like a kettle finding its boil. Some households grew sly. There are tales probably more delightful than true of windows that opened inward to avoid being seen of shutters, carved to look solid from the street and transparent from the kitchen of mirrored light, wells that smuggled sun like a parcel under a coat. My favorite, because it is so peacefully unprovable, is the rumor of a man who built a single enormous window, divided with bars into the suggestion of many tiny ones, and then argued successfully that the taxpayer should count it as one generous eye rather than a dozen small peaks. Inspectors, like cats, dislike being tricked, but enjoy a good story. One imagines they laughed and wrote one. Economists describe the window tax as a stare between the old world of hearth levies and the new world of income and property assessments. To the people who lived under it, it was a routine with seasons. Spring was mortar time, when improvements made sense and paint dried obediently. Summer was the season of clean panes and honest daylight, when even the thrifty admitted that sunshine, divided by tax, still produced pleasure. Autumn was for caulking and cunning, for draperies chosen as an elegant way to pretend a room had fewer responsibilities. Winter was a time to cherish the windows one kept, to let a square of sky serve as a clock, to read by the last pale light long enough to find the next candle. The repeal came with less fanfare than some would like. Parliamentary reports aside, doctors compiled case notes about crowded rooms. Urban reformers advocated wider streets, which required light to be fashionable again. Industry needed bright workshops, less fingers become statistics. Eventually, the tax book turned its gaze to other measures of wealth, more abstract, less picturesque. But the landscape it left behind still knows the trick. Cities carry the memory on their faces. You can read terraces like scores of music. A flourish of windows marks a confident tune. A brace of bricked rectangles suggests a pause. Plaster remembers everything. Bricks keep secrets without malice. Mortar ages the way cake stales, politely. There is a sleepy poetry in how light became an entry in a ledger. Every society decides what to measure and, by measuring, what to encourage. You can argue that the window tax taught frugality in a language of bricks and shadows, or you can argue that it discouraged health. Both can be true while the street goes on being itself. Meanwhile, historians work in archives, counting petitions folded like old birds, finding the handwriting of a widow who begged to keep one extra sash because her husband read there, or the neat letter of a landlord who feared that symmetry, if disturbed, would lower the tone of an address. These are the human footnotes of public policy, ordinary, exact, and somehow still warm. Think of the little domestic rituals that grew up around the levee. A child climbs a chair to decorate the inside of a blocked window with chalk curls, the way children draw on bandages. A shopkeeper washes the panes she does keep with methodical pride, as if cleanliness could multiply light. A mason learns to match old brick with new so skillfully that his work becomes an invisible craft. A seamstress who rents a room with 2 lawful windows and 1 illegal one, disguised under heavy curtains times, her stitches to the slow travel of a sunbeam across her table, aware that the beam is slightly narrower than it might have been. These are not tragedies. They are the dust that explains why a shelf holds exactly the number of plates it holds. By the time the tax book stopped counting, the habit of noticing windows had lodged itself comfortably in the public mind. Writers used windows to explain personalities. Painters arranged them like sentences. Reformers pointed to them during speeches with the same gravity a teacher uses with a blackboard. Even today, real estate listings speak of light-filled rooms with a fervor that suggests light. Properly managed confers virtue. And in older districts, when a walker pauses and puzzles over a neatly bricked rectangle, they are without realizing it, reading a small moment of negotiation between the desire for brightness and the desire to keep a few more coins for bread. There are gentler endings if you prefer them. Imagine an inspector on his last day. He walks his route slowly because routine is a kind of friendship. He notes that the baker has reopened a second-story sash now that the rates have fallen and that the cats approve. He sees a school where children lean over slates and bless daylight. He watches a seam of mortar in a terrace crumbling in the exact way mortar prefers. He closes his notebook for the last time and feels the light on his face. He is perhaps the only man in town who can say precisely how much daylight the street paid for this year. And if you're drifting, you can think of the sober comfort in counting things that are not entirely countable. We measure windows and end up measuring light. We add columns and end up adding warnings. Tomorrow, someone will open a shutter and let the sun find the sink. Somewhere else, a bird will sit on a sill that used to be a book's worth of brick. The city will practice breathing through its old, careful ribs. The past will remain polite and unhurried, bricked here, bright there. Exactly the sort of arrangement that lets a person fall asleep while a voice goes on, quietly pleased, counting. You might not expect a library to begin with a daydream about warehouses and boats, but that is where the story gets pleasantly drowsy. A king in a new city beside a long blue harbor imagines shelves so tall that the scrolls behave like citizens, and he imagines them arriving by ship, like sleepy travelers who never argue at customs. The plan was simple in the way plans sound simple when you explain them while pointing at water. Every book in the world would come here. Everything written would be copied, cataloged, and coaxed into order. And then, like a well-fed cat, knowledge would settle on the windowsills and stay. If you were still awake by the time we reached the section about how to hold a scroll without smudging the margins, you may subscribe or you may not, which is also a form of subscription in the language of pillows. I will continue in a whisper either way. The king's name was Ptolemy, which in Greek tastes like a consonant with a scarf on. He ruled a sparkling, deliberate city called Alexandria, drawn on the edge of Egypt like a neat signature. The harbor was busy enough to be a soft metronome, oars, ropes, fish, and voices counting amphorae, which are jars shaped like answers. Into this bustle the royal decree arrived with an unhurried certainty. Ships that docked would declare their books. If a text was found, it would be borrowed the way monarchs borrowed things. It would be taken to the scribes, copied without haste, and the copy returned to the owner with thanks, and one imagines the kind of smile that means yes, this is yours now, and also somehow ours. The original stayed. If this sounds a bit like a library built from politely confiscated luggage, that is not a bad way to picture it. The harbor became a net for words. Every arrival had a list, every list discovered a gap, and each gap suggested a letter to a distant scholar who might fill it, if the winds were generous and the ink did not sulk. The building itself sits in our minds more firmly than in the earth, which has mislaid it, as earth does. We picture courtyards with measured shade, long rooms that sound like sandals, and corridors where the air smells faintly of reed pens. The librarians were not shy about their ambitions. They wrote to kings and asked for poets. They wrote to poets and asked for kings. They hired scholars who could quarrel about adjectives for 3 polite hours and then go to dinner as friends. They collected texts the way the sea collects foam. When a great scholar arrived, someone took a census of his thoughts, what versions of Homer he favored, which fragments of lyric he preferred, which punctuation marks he distrusted. In the evenings, the sea touched the foundations, and the whole collection, in theory, hummed. Even a dream requires a filing system. The librarians kept a catalog with the sturdy title of Tables, which is charming, because the catalog itself was probably a scroll, and therefore not a table at all. These tables, compiled by a man with a bookkeeper's patience and a poet's stamina, listed authors, works, first lines, and helpful remarks such as authentic, probably authentic, or the soothingly non-committal others say. It is one thing to own books and quite another to know which copy argues with which. In the margins, someone would note a better reading, or a suspicious line, or a conjecture that looked so reasonable it surely had a hat. Scholars call this emendation. Readers call it helpful when it is right and intrusive when it is not. The librarians called it Tuesday. The copyists worked with the uncomplaining rhythm of people who have ink in their fingerprints. Papyrus came from the marshes where the reeds rise like careful hair. Strips were cut, laid crosswise, soaked, pressed, and dried in the sun until they forgot they'd ever been plants. The sheets were glued edge to edge into long, even roads called colomata, then rolled around wooden rods that waited without comment. Ink was a patient mixture of soot and gum, dark as a good night. A reed pen made a soft scratching noise like a polite cricket. Scribes who were feeling cautious left generous margins, which is why so many later readers had room for opinions. There were rules about titles and tailpieces, rules about beginning the text after a few blank turns so the opening would not crack. Even small courtesies about how to hold the roll while reading so no one elbowed a passage into oblivion. If a cat walked across a drying sheet, a thing cats have always known how to do, the paw prints could be sanded away or kept as a form of punctuation that says, "Here the universe briefly assisted." The library gathered not only poetry, but also the prose that makes a civilization aware of its furniture. Treatises on medicine and mathematics, notes on astronomy, shopping lists of stars. There were cookery hints disguised as agricultural advice, and agricultural advice disguised as philosophy. Someone here measured the earth with shadows and was off by less than the width of a sea. Someone there designed a screw to coax water uphill because wells can be stubborn. Someone improved the calendar so the months would stop wandering like sheep. When you picture these innovations, turn down the volume. There was no trumpet, only the sound a hand makes when it finds the right tool and decides to keep it. The scholars, being human, had favorite texts and favorite errors. If one set of verses came in 3 slightly different versions, the librarians sometimes wrote a tidy fourth. They did not mean harm. They meant to repair the furniture of meaning so it would stop wobbling. Arguments broke out about whether a misplaced line was a mistake or a feature. Someone would describe a poet as sweet, someone else as honey sweet, and a third would note, in a measured tone, that honey itself has grades. On days when the wind was kind, you could find a grammarian standing in a doorway, explaining to no one in particular that a word's true force lies not in its sound but in its position. On other days, you could find the same grammarian asleep in the catalog room, convinced that sleep would place his own words in better order. Through the gates came the texts of Egypt and Persia, of small islands that liked to name winds, of cities where men lectured on geometry with the air of people folding linen. A traveler might bring a jar and a story, and, almost as an afterthought, a local law code tied with string. Merchants carried tailies more faithful than the gods, and less faithful than the tides. Somewhere in the stacks, a clerk invented a little symbol to mark doubtful lines. Somewhere else, a visiting sage corrected the clerk and invented a different symbol, which is the scholarly version of friendship bracelets. If you hold this scene in your mind long enough, you can hear the whispering rhythm of shelves accepting new rolls, the soft tap as each rod finds. Its pigeonhole the sigh of a reader, discovering that a familiar passage has been improved in a way that makes it politely unfamiliar. Craft lived in the background like a dependable neighbor. There were professional binders of papyrus who could spot a weak seam from the doorway. There were glue recipes that read like lullabies: boil, skim, stir, rest. There were cases shaped to fit unusual roles, because some authors love a long sentence and see no reason to stop. There were simple rewinding tools, little wooden spindles, that returned a text to the beginning with the patience of people who enjoy tidying. In the colder months, the librarians dried their hands over coals before touching certain rolls, because papyrus, like conversation, dislikes damp fingers. You can almost see the scene: a scholar holding his palms to the warmth, counting silently to 40, and then lifting a text as if it were a kitten that happens to contain Euclid. Stories about the destruction arrive like seagulls, calling in many directions at once. One version says a general set fire to the ships in the harbor, and the flames wandered inland with the disobedient cleverness of fire. Another says later rulers, eager for a neater city and a simpler religion, studied the shelves and decided they were too complicated. Yet another version blames the thing no one can ever indict, which is time. It is loud news told in a dreamy voice. You will notice that all the stories include heat, either literal or political, and a library is particularly vulnerable to both. Papyrus prefers gossip to bonfires. Scholarship prefers the kind of argument that ends in lunch. When the stories grow confusing, it helps to think of the practical side. A blaze that begins with ropes and tar will lick everything that invites it. Shelves, scrolls, lint that thinks it is wood. These invite. A decree that begins by listing the proper ways to behave will eventually notice the way books behave when they disagree with decrees. Gradually or quickly, the doors tighten. There was, by most accounts, another set of rooms across the city, a daughter collection in a temple courtyard where statues stood like large, courteous librarians. When the mother shelves suffered, the daughter survived for a time and then developed her own difficulties. Some say soldiers used the courtyard as a lesson in cleaning. Some say the statues watched as an earnest crowd decided that old gods made poor roommates for new faith. A clever teacher might tell you the exact year. A drowsy one will say, it happened as such things happen, through a series of tidy decisions that added up to less tidiness than anyone desired. A scroll does not vote, but can be counted. When the counting stops, you notice the quiet. Even without flames and decrees, there is the kind of disappearance that requires no villain. Papyrus is a cheerful optimist until the weather changes. In damp seasons, it swells like bread. In insects, it discovers romance. In careless hands, it discovers origami. A text left at the wrong angle becomes a wedge. A copy made in haste breeds generations of relatives, each with a nose slightly more inventive than the last. The librarians had systems to prevent this: racks, rules, ceremonies of dusting, but dusting is not a story that travels far. Somewhere a reader laid a roll on a sill and went to answer a question about lunch. A breeze came, the roll fell. A boy stepped on it by accident and apologized to no one in particular. This is not tragedy. This is the arithmetic of matter. What, then, was inside those missing shelves that makes us lean forward, very gently, as if the answer might wake? Probably a great deal of what we already know, but earlier. Medical notes with careful cautions that still smell of herbs. Star charts with lines drawn so tenderly that the constellations look like family diagrams. Plays whose jokes depend on an actor raising one eyebrow, which is hard to annotate. Lost epics that would not be lost if the authors had written shorter. Ordinary letters that tell us what cost how much, and who thought who was tiresome, and which street had the best figs. My favorite speculative item is a collection of corrections, a rule that says only, "Here we found a better word." The best libraries hoard not only answers, but improved questions. The what if is tempting and should be handled like a warm teapot, useful, but patient. If the scrolls had stayed, would mathematics have hurried? Possibly. Would another machine have been invented a century earlier to stir water or letters? Perhaps. More likely, the presence of so much orderly knowledge would have encouraged the very human habit of rereading. People in every age love to explain that they would have gone faster if the road had been straighter, ignoring the fact that we enjoy walking as much as arriving. The missing shelves invite us to imagine ourselves as remarkably industrious. Meanwhile, a librarian of any century will tell you that the most common sound in a library is not the turning of pages, but the quiet that surrounds it, which means someone is finally comfortable. The echo is not only in universities, which keep catalogs with titles so precise they sound like declarations of peace. It is also in the way we store our present. We visit archives where the climate is steadier than the weather outside, and we put our ideas into boxes that look exactly the same from the hallway, because sameness is relaxing. We digitize, which is copying by a very small light, and then we back it up, which is copying of the copying, because we have learned that harbor fires and budget meetings share an appetite. We write metadata the way the Alexandrians wrote tables, and we argue about what to call things with the same gentle ferocity they enjoyed. We accept that a file without a label is a traveler who will never find a room. Sometimes in museums, you can stand in front of a scrap of papyrus that once rested in a reader's lap while someone in the next room prepared olives. The scrap looks like toast. The letters stand in their ranks without spaces, confident that a trained eye will hear the spaces even if it cannot see them. There are places where a worm has eaten a thoughtful ellipse. There are places where a scribe corrected himself with a dot that says, in ancient handwriting, ahem. People take photographs and then lower their phones as if afraid to wake the fragment, which has already slept longer than any gallery attendant. The piece is modest. It does not claim to be from the library. It simply is, and therefore we recognize the gesture of survival. What lingers most, perhaps, is the habit of treating knowledge like a port city. Ideas arrive. We inspect them for pests and possibilities. We make a copy for safety. We send the copy back into the world with a politely stamped passport. The shelves we imagine in Alexandria keep teaching that arrangement is not the enemy of curiosity, it is curiosity's pillow. When a student writes a bibliography at 2 in the morning and lines up the commas obediently, they are participating in the soft civic life of libraries. When a mathematician titles a lemma so carefully that it could be mistaken for a proverb, she is waving to a clerk who once wrote authentic with a small flourish. If you are still with me, your breathing probably matches the long wave of that imagined harbor. Ships come in. Lines are tied. A clerk walks along the quay with a small board and a little bottle of ink and asks, with the politeness of tradition, whether the ship carries any texts. The captain does, in fact, have a few. The clerk thanks him, copies them, returns something indistinguishable but not identical, and the day goes on. The wind shifts. Somewhere inland, a reader finishes a roll, rewinds it with a spindle that squeaks once, and tucks it back into its place. The catalog receives a quiet tick mark. A librarian closes their eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to arrange the next hour. And the thought arrives that the Library of Alexandria was not only a building, or a dream, or a rumor about fire, but a posture the way a city tilts its head when listening. You could fall asleep on that posture. It is patient and not at all surprised by loss. It understands that shelves are temporary, even when the urge to shelf is permanent. It thinks in duplicates, triplicates, and in little notes that say, others say. It is content to preserve a recipe for glue because glue holds the world together in the least dramatic way available. When the night is quiet enough, you can hear the echo of reeds being cut, of soot being ground, of a careful finger smoothing a seam, of a reader smiling at a sentence that finally remembers itself. And as you drift, the harbor stretches, the ships become dots, the city becomes a neat signature again, and the shelves, real or not, keep humming, like a very old song that never needed a chorus. You might not expect a world-changing library to begin with a shopping list, but that is how the dream first behaves in the sources, a calm inventory of what knowledge a city might like to own. In the quiet after a sea breeze, a new king and a new capital looked over the harbor and asked for everything: poems and seed catalogs, star charts and cookbooks, law codes and riddles that only work in dialect. The request was not dramatic. It sounded more like a clerk ordering amphory. Yet from the steady tone, Alexandria's plan unfolded with the sleepy confidence of someone rearranging furniture. At dusk, because the room will surely be better this way. If Yuri's still awake when I reach the part about where to place the citation mark shaped like a fishbone, you can subscribe. Or you can let that decision drift to the end of the shelf. Either route is perfectly alphabetical. The first detail is beautifully unhurried. Every ship entering the great harbor declared its cargo. Among amphory and grain, scribes sought for books, which is to say scrolls, tied with string and smug about it. The policy was gracious and practical. The state would borrow the texts, copy them with exacting care, return a duplicate to the owner, and keep the original in the royal collection, which feels a little like borrowing your neighbor's ladle and choosing to keep the one that stirs best. The harbor itself did half the work. It brought to the city whatever the winds had decided to think about that week. Sailors stepped onto stone with tar on their hands and stories on their tongues, and those stories, when written down, became the kind of evidence libraries prefer. We picture rooms that are all right angles and even temper, with sun laid down in strips, so steady you can count your day by the stripe you stand in. The building belonged to the larger Mausoleum, a home for the muses that functioned like an academic monastery without monks, where scholars were paid to argue quietly and eat on time. Fish were grilled somewhere within earshot of geometry. A medical lecturer would share a corridor with a poet who was suspicious of adjectives. A mathematician might stop to borrow a metaphor and return it sharpened. The head librarian kept keys that were more symbolic than necessary. The shelves were mostly niches in the walls, with cubbies for scrolls whose wooden rods wore neat caps, like well-dressed umbrellas. At the end of each roll, a little tag basilicos announce the title, the author, sometimes a helpful warning such as corrected from the edition of Timotheus, who prefers long lines. Administration arrived with the same soft tread. A statesman named Demetrius, exiled from Athens for being intensely efficient, helped invent procedures that still feel familiar: acquisition, cataloging, preservation, and the tea temperature of interdepartmental notes. Callimachus, a poet with organizational stamina, compiled the Pinax tablets, a grand catalog in many books that listed authors, incipits, subjects, and the sort of remarks that let experts quarrel pleasantly. Imagine a librarian's long scroll whispering, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, 9 books, begins, "This is the exposure of Herodotus. Please see also those who deny it, and the smaller Herodotus was not this one." The catalog did not sell arguments. It built little padded rooms for them. Acquisition favored thoroughness over speed. Scholars wrote to rulers and private collectors with requests that sounded curiously domestic. If you visit, please bring the tragedians, and if you cannot bring the tragedians, bring the better mistakes about them. When a rare copy of a poet appeared, the staff compared it against others with a row of small symbols, the dipole viobellos, the coronis marks that look like a philosopher's doodles and mean, respectively, "Note this, suspect this, and you may rest now." Homer was treated like a slightly unruly grandfather at a family dinner. Everyone loved him. No one entirely trusted where he put his elbows. The Alexandrians produced editions whose calm margins suggest they spent entire afternoons persuading a single line to stand up straight. Meanwhile, outside the reading rooms, the port kept pushing knowledge ashore. The Pharos lighthouse, a high finger of white stone, blinked instructions at dusk like a very old notification bell. Pilots from Rhodes, Cilicia, Judea, the Black Sea, and places the catalog called Elsewhere, where the apples are large, arrived with texts written in scripts that required favors from translators. A scroll of legal cases from a frontier garrison might sit next to a manual on making purple dye that stains everything it loves. In this setting, the dream of completeness seemed reasonable in the way quiet rooms make unreasonable goals feel polite. To finish the world, one need only finish today's copying, write a small note to the astronomy desk, and, before supper, label a jar of soot ink so the night shift will not mistake it for fruit syrup. One learns quickly that papyrus is not patient, but it pretends well. The River Nile provided the reeds, which teams sliced, soaked, pressed, and dried until the fibers kept a straight face. Sheets were joined with a marriage seam called cholysis, a word that rolls off the tongue as neatly as it is rolled onto a stick. A good sheet welcomed ink like a guest. A poor sheet repelled it with sulks. Soot for ink came from oil lamps and cheerful neglect. Gum arabic gave it manners. A touch of vinegar kept the color from being too pleased with itself. The pen, the calamus, was a shaped reed with a slit that behaved like a little reservoir. It made a crisp sound, the library's favorite music. Scribes spoke about line length as if discussing recipes. Titles were written in red when fancy allowed, and fancy often did. Reading a scroll resembled petting a well-behaved steak. You unrolled with one hand while rolling with the other, and learned to time your breathing to the text. To help the serpent behave, readers used a small aid, a horn or wooden cylinder to keep the full roll tidy. You could place it in your lap like an infant with long opinions. Lines were arranged in columns. A coronis at the end told you that both the text and your wrists could relax. Greeks wrote in scriptio continua, words without spaces, the original version of a run-on sentence, which is friendlier in practice than in theory because your eyes learn to hear the pauses. When accent marks arrived centuries later, some librarians protested that they made the page look busy, which is a fair criticism of both diacritics and certain public gardens. Storage meant dust, and dust meant ritual. The staff beat the shelves with bundles of clean reeds, not to punish the furniture, but to encourage. Parasites to find a more interesting profession. Roll-ins were capped with elegant knobs. Important texts wore cases. The very delicate slumbered in wooden chests like elderly relatives wrapped for travel. There were climate rules. Do not unroll on days the air feels like soup. Keep the lamps high and the wicks humble. Never read while wearing oil on your hands, no matter how sharp you find your cuticles. It all sounds fussy until you recall that a sneeze can crease a century. The city gathered not only written things, but thinking people. Euclid organized theorems into a ladder that anyone could climb if they did not mind climbing forever. Erophilus and Erasistratus, anatomists with brave friends, described parts of the body that had previously been content to be referred to as the area just there. Eratosthenes measured the earth with a shadow in a traveler's itinerary, and was wrong by so little it hardly counts as an error. If you can forgive a planet for not being perfectly round, you can forgive a librarian for using a camel's pace as a unit. Opposition poets complained that the place smelt of ink and fish, which it did, and that scribes had opinions about meter, which they certainly did. The library answered by quietly producing a better map of the sky. There were human touches everywhere. Someone kept a basket for lost styluses and a list of owners written in increasingly hopeful handwriting. Someone put cats on the payroll as Mausers, a policy later summarized as effective, occasionally opinionated. A minor scholar lodged a complaint that the copies of Sappho were shelved too near the kitchen, where steam made the pages flirt. The chief librarian issued a memo reminding staff that arguments about Homer's birthplace should not block the corridor outside the astronomy room. Recorded on a jar shard is the earliest known instance of a reader asking for something shorter by the same author, a request that has never since gone out of fashion. Stories about the fires arrive like evening gusts, each from a different quarter. One says Julius Caesar burned his own ships to keep them from being borrowed permanently, and the flames wandered ashore with the opportunism of fire, nibbling at warehouses, then shelves, taking what heat loves best, tidy kindling. Another tells of a later age that preferred uniform beliefs and thought shelves looked untidy. A third believes in neglect as a policy disguised as accident. Each tale uses the same pallet rope, dry wood, heat, and an official who sleeps well and asks us to choose. The library refuses to testify. It leaves us with the physics of papyrus and the human habit of meaning well. Caesar's version has that crisp logistical feeling. In 48 BCE, war arrived by staircase. The harbor filled with fast decisions. Accounts say the general ordered the fleet torched and the wind handled the rest. Or that granaries became lanterns and the city discovered new light. In such haze, a clerk would not save a catalog. A clerk would save a friend. Another century supplies another scene. The Serapeum, a temple with its own stacks, a daughter library, sees crowds and soldiers and a decree against old gods. The statues look on as if they possess opinions, which statues often do. Later still, a narrative arrives in which a conqueror is asked what to do with the books and gives the sort of answer that sounds decisive and therefore rarely belongs to history. Scholars with calm wrists note the problems in each account and write footnotes that behave like small, polite extinguishers. Between episodes of flame, there were thousands of mornings when nothing dramatic occurred, which is the normal way knowledge disappears. Copyists miscopied. Insects celebrated festivals the librarians did not sanction. Humidity bent a scroll into a smile from which it never recovered. An official failed to fund a repair because budgets are poems about priorities. A teacher died. His students preferred a newer teacher who told better jokes. The shelves learned how to thin themselves without spectacle. Paper hearts break loudly. Papyrus hearts do not. It is possible to lose a civilization's shopping list one careless hour at a time. When people speak of a final extinction, they mean a threshold after which the city remembers with ache rather than with bustle. The shelves become stories. The rooms keep their names but acquire new tenants. In this version, the librarians do not rage. They tidy their desks and teach elsewhere. Their habits walk out with them. The way to stack rolls so they breathe. The trick of binding the seam so it does not peel in the south wind. The look you give a comma when it misbehaves. The dream of everything does not end. It moves apartments. What might have been on the missing rolls is the portion of the tale that grows happiest in the telling. We imagine a comedy by Menander that would have made your cousin laugh even today, because cousins haven't changed. We imagine a treatise on automata with a sketch of a water clock that pours precisely 3 cups and then tells time by opinion. We imagine early catalogs of plants with phrases like resistant to mood, a medical compendium where a doctor admits that patients sometimes feel better when spoken to very seriously, and a philosophy primer written for impatient teenagers that says gently that boredom is a tool. We also imagine the usual clutter: laundry notes, drafts of letters, receipts that prove someone once bought a small lion and regretted it. Loss is less romantic when you can hear it sneeze. If we play the what-if game quietly, we can picture calendars improve faster, star tables corrected sooner, a method for teaching geometry that allows left-handed students to feel immediately superior. Perhaps a steam toy becomes a steam habit, and the city acquires little engines that pull carts of figs. Or perhaps everything proceeds at the human tempo anyway, because people prefer to argue, then agree, then celebrate their agreement so thoroughly that the argument must begin again. Libraries do not actually rush time, they domesticate it. The echo of Alexandria is easy to find once you know to look for it. It is in every reading room with a window set too high to be distracting. It is in the climate-controlled vault where a conservator cradles a brittle ledger and speaks to it as if it were a child. Quite often the ledger behaves accordingly. It is in the way modern catalogs dignify the chaos of ideas with numbers and names, mark fields, and subject headings, which sound like pieces of a ship and indeed behave like rigging. It lingers in barcodes, which are the 21st century silly boy, little title tags that whisper to machines. A library card is a passport with a very patient border guard. Digital collections have built new harbors. Servers hum like thoughtful bees. Backups copy the copy of the copy because the memory of earlier losses has become a reflex. Curators speak of checksums with the tenderness their ancestors reserved for sturdy glue. Bit rot is an unfortunate term for the way information forgets itself, and institutions fight it with the same gentle stubbornness used against papyrus-eating insects. There are debates about open access that would have charmed Callimachus: who may read, who may copy, who may keep the better version. In one sense, the arguments have simply changed costumes. In another sense, they show how Alexandria convinced us that shelves, whether wood or cloud, are civic architecture. Walk into any busy research library, and you will meet the descendants of those harbor rules. Bags are opened and peered into, not from suspicion, but from tradition. Food is discouraged so the air can stay simple. Pencils, not pens, in certain rooms, because erasing is an act of love. You can watch a student fall asleep on a spread of articles about calendars, which is on theme, and wake with a statement underlined that did not deserve underlining, also on theme. Librarians answer questions whose answers are charging their phones at home. Someone returns a book late and pays a fine that is more ceremonial than punitive, like paying respect to time itself. If you listen, you can hear the old port and the shuffle of footnotes. Museums keep the conclusions of the story, a scorch mark on a once-rolled edge, a reed pen that remembers a hand, a fragment whose first line is, "About olive pits one must," and then it breaks off like a sneeze that is also philosophy. Such bits do not confess where they lived. They do not need to. The calm with which they persist is a kind of address. The legend of Alexandria survives as an instruction more than as a site plan. Copy what you can, label it kindly, shelve it where friends can find it, and expect loss without approving of it. If you are still with me, imagine the harbor at night. The Pharos throws a cool square of light far out to sea. Ropes creak. A clerk carries a little box for collecting titles and a stub of red chalk for writing a pleasant lie that says, "Returned as received." In a room inland, someone rounds a letter more carefully than required because neatness feels like a promise. The cataloger adds a small note and a modest hand. Others say, and in those two words you can hear the entire institution, the entire city consenting to host uncertainty. A cat decides that papyrus is a better bed than principle and is, as usual, correct. We do not need to force an ending on this. The library is a verb as much as a place. It shelves, it copies, it doubts, it hums. When the wind lifts, a few reeds in the marsh lean toward one another as if conferring. A scribe sets down a pen to drink and returns to find the ink less eager, the line more patient. Somewhere, a student starts a bibliography and does not finish it because drowsiness, which is also a form of order, has shown up to help. The dream of Ptolemy breathes in little breaths. The sea answers with little waves. And the shelves, whether present or remembered, continue to straighten themselves, waiting for the next soft arrival. You might not expect a vanished library to leave behind so many instructions for ordinary things like where to set a lamp so moths admire the light. But not the papyrus, but that is how the story begins tonight, with a lamp placed 2 handspans from a wall that has not existed for a very long time. Alexandria liked practical beginnings. A king stood on a windy terrace above a harbor that behaved like a busy conversation, and asked a question that sounded like a shopping errand. What if we collected everything worth rereading? The phrasing was modest, like asking a neighbor for a pinch of salt, though the neighbor in this case was the entire Mediterranean. The vision did not arrive as a trumpet. It arrived as a table, a chair, and a decision about where to put the catalog, so it would be both in the way and indispensable. If you're still awake when I get to the recipe for glue that resists humidity, feel free to subscribe or dream about glue. Either option, frankly, is on brand for this channel. The city made generosity into bureaucracy, which is an art. Ships entering the harbor declared their cargo. The harbor clerks declared their curiosity. A polite policy welcomed visiting scrolls for temporary inspection, a phrase that historians repeat with a smile that can't decide if it's praise. The state provided a copy to the owner and kept the best version for itself. A gesture rather like borrowing a neighbor's fig tree and returning a potted fig cutting with a handwritten note, thanking them for sharing the original soil. No one seemed angry enough to take minutes. The lighthouse watched all this with the comfortable arrogance of tall buildings. At night, its light fell softly on the water like a bookmark you forgot to remove. Inside, the Mauseum, the home of the muses, functioned less like a museum and more like a university that had mislaid the concept of tuition and chosen instead lunch. Scholars received stipends, rooms, and permission to argue by paragraph. The head librarian carried keys whose authority was mostly ceremonial. Doors in an institution like this are usually open, and the locked ones are mostly pretending. Rooms were arranged so that a mathematician walking to a lecture might accidentally learn to pronounce a rare Doric vowel from the philology corridor, then apologize to the vowel for the intrusion. The city understood that knowledge grows in the same manner as bread dough left too near a warm window. It expands, It leans, and if you do not watch it, it will develop opinions. If you are wondering about furniture, the answer is yes. There were couches, because reading upright is admirable in theory. Wall niches held the scrolls. Each roll ended in a little round cap that made the shelves look like a parade of modest doorknobs. The tags tied to roll ends, the silly boys served as name badges for shy text. Some tags included a crisp, beginning of text phrase to help you verify you had the right roll. A kindness in an age before the search bar learned to cite our spelling. The floor plan was not mystical. It was sensible. Astronomy near the roofline for light. Medicine not too far from water. Poetry wherever the acoustics forgave enthusiasm. Cats, which require no cataloging, were given jobs that they performed with the selective excellence of cats. Acquisitions never slept. They just took naps in several languages. Letters went out to Rhodes, to Pergamon, to Athens, to the pockets of Asia Minor that insisted on being called something in particular this season. The tone of a typical request was both urgent and sleepy. If possible, send tragedies by next equinox. If impossible, send your finest complaints about earlier editions, as we collect those too. The staff purchased private libraries when lighthouses or sulfur mines or dynastic changes made selling urgent. A rumor survives of agents hunting a sturdy copy of Sappho and returning with 10 delicate ones instead, which feels correct for both poetry and errands. Callimachus, who liked poems as crisp as a folded sheet, compiled the Pineaches, a many-volume catalog that attempted to hold the institution by its lapels and remind it of its own contents. He listed authors, titles, incipits, subjects, and a few remarks to ensure future arguments would be pleasantly focused. A modern librarian would recognize the mood, the thrill of adding a new record, the suspicion that one's predecessors were brilliant but untidy, the little sigh when an author insists on having been born in 3 different cities. The catalog did not pretend to finish. It pretended to continue, which is all a good catalog should pretend. Let us drift to the paper itself, which is not paper but papyrus, the Nile made into stationery. Workers sliced the pith of the reed into thin strips, soaked them until they remembered how to be flexible, pressed them first in one direction, then in another, the crosshatch we still call the reason the sheet behaves, and dried the result on clean stone. The best sheets had a shine like patient fruit. The ordinary ones had texture that kept pens honest. Soot ink, the standard, was made from lampblack and gum arabic, seasoned with whatever the scribe's teacher swore by, a touch of vinegar, a superstition, a half-remembered blessing. The reed pen, the calamus, was sharpened with a small knife that also served to nudge commas into better neighborhoods. Scribes did not so much write a scroll as choreograph it. Columns were measured by the width of breath. A coronus at the end looked like a bird that had decided to sit down. Scriptio continua words without spaces was more restful than it sounds. Your eyes learned the path the way feet learn a familiar street. Corrections wore their own punctuation. The dipole, a neat wedge, pointed to lines worth attention. The obellos stabbed gently at words suspected of being inflated. The antisigma wagged like a high-browed finger. The margin became a room where future scholars left quiet, carefully initialed disagreements. If you ever wish to fall asleep while feeling productive, imagine adding a cautious dipole to a line from Homer and then making tea about it. The library's economics would please any accountant fond of papyrus receipts. Copying houses, some inside the Mausian, some unofficial across the street charged by the 100 lines, with surcharges for particularly argumentative poets. The state bought ink by the amphora and paid stipends at an hour that suggested the treasurer disliked afternoons. There were storage policies: unroll fragile works only on cool mornings, avoid lamp heat, never taste the pigment no matter how convincingly purple, and keep scroll ends capped, because capless ends are how dust chooses its friends. An annual cleaning day involved reed beaters, cloths, and the ceremonial reading of the "nothing is anyone's fault, but please does better" memo. People, of course, animated the shelves. Euclid organized geometry into a book that still behaves like well-laid paving stones. Eratosthenes measured the earth with a stick, a well, and an agreeable camel root. He named himself Philologos, lover of reasoned words, the kind of job title modern offices would turn into an email signature. Eryphilus, a physician, described nerves with the patience of someone gently untangling string. Poets argued about how much the gods should resemble relatives. A minor scholar recorded the earliest known complaint about drafts. The northern door encouraged thought but not shoulders. A major scholar recorded the earliest known complaint about minor scholars and then quoted himself approvingly. If we move forward very slowly, we encounter the heat of rumor, which moves faster than any catalog can. The first blaze, attached famously to Caesar's siege, feels like a maritime accident that learned to walk ashore. Ships were burned to keep them from being borrowed by the wrong side. The wind, unburdened by policy, carried flames to warehouses and perhaps to annexes where texts waited for calmer governance. Some accounts say the main building survived. Others say the loss was more intimate. In all versions, clerks ran with ledgers because ledgers help you explain future losses. No one thinks to save the memo about lamp placement, which is a shame for my opening anecdote, but good for the tone of antiquity. Another darkness arrives generations later at the Serapeum, a temple with a prestigious daughter library. There, a mixture of state, faith, and neighborhood politics made the book stacks notice their own vulnerability. Statues were toppled with the solemn energy that crowds reserve for metaphors. Whether the scroll rooms burned or were scattered is a detail that sources treat like a secret handshake. Scholars recognize one another by which version they prefer. Later still, stories about conquerors deciding the fate of books enter the scene with the tidy certainty that suggests a moral lesson rather than a municipal record. It is good to keep them. It is also good to sit down before arguing about them. Between these famous turns, the quiet erosion did most of the work. Insects committed acts of unlicensed enthusiasm. A humid summer encouraged seams to lift. The good glue ran out before the next shipment. The substitute glue had a personality. A young assistant stacked rolls horizontally when vertical would have been wiser. A senior assistant corrected the stack and made a note. A teacher died. His students loved him, but not his handwriting. It is hard to dramatize obligations not met because the afternoon was hot, but history is built on such heat. If you have ever meant to file something and then carefully didn't, you have taken part in a minor reenactment. Suppose we step back to the craftsmanship again because it is soothing. Selecting a reed for a pen involved knocking the cane and listening for the right hollowness. A satisfying note meant it would hold ink like a secret. The slit of the nib decided how loudly the writing would speak. Inks differed by climate. A coastal formula frowned at inland winters. Bookcases were brushed with oil, not for shine, but for the insect's opinion of oil. Copyists swarmed stiff scrolls over charcoal pots at a distance measured in fingers and caution. There was an official jar labeled for paste, and an unofficial jar labeled for morale. A clever repairer could lift a torn fiber, tease it back into company, and persuade it to stay with a dab so gentle you would swear it was praise. We can pause for pure pettiness, as it too is historical. A grammarian scowled that a colleague had inserted too many breathing marks, as if language had developed asthma. A poet complained that the catalogers put his work after a rival whose name began with the same letter, but the wrong moral outlook. Someone launched a formal inquiry into the vanishing of 3 styluses and discovered them under a cat who refused to cooperate. A mathematician wrote a marginal note so long it quietly became a treatise. Lunch was fish again. The astronomers chewed gazing up, which is the correct way to chew in a city where the sky keeps secrets. The city itself played archivist. The lighthouse did the thing lighthouses do, kept time for people who trusted light more than memory. The wind sorted smells, brine to the port, come to the kitchens, hot bronze to the workshops, and ink to the rooms where arguments were polite. A visitor might hear the call of a water cellar and mistake it for a line break. A resident would hear a line break and think a water cellar had changed careers. On certain afternoons, the sun fell into the colonnades like a series of doorways, and everyone pretended it was a calendar. Alexandria loved pretending. Why dwell on a place that cannot answer back? Because its soft habits, copy steadily, label kindly, disagree in small handwriting, became the way later minds behaved. Medieval scriptoria, with their wax tablets and candle soot, continued the choreography: read, pause, breathe, mark a dipole, correct what can be corrected, and let the rest be remembered. Renaissance collectors ran their own harbors made of letters and couriers. Modern libraries label spines with numbers that are neither mythic nor arbitrary. They are a lighthouse made of decimals. A barcode is simply a 21st century syllabus with ambitions. The legend gives us permission to be boring in the noble sense, to insist that climate control is a love language, to care whether the top shelf is 2 degrees warmer than the bottom, to set reminders for backups that backups until the server room. Looks like a tree diagram wearing mittens. Bit rot is a phrase the ancients would have adored. It sounds like a moral failing and is in fact a chemical one. A modern conservator tap-taps a screen the way an old scribe tap-tapped a reed. Both listen for that same agreeable hollowness that means the tool will hold what it is asked to hold. The what-ifs are enjoyable in very small spoonfuls. What if the catalog survived entire, and we could stroll down a list and mutter, "Ah yes, the lost book on designing civic fountains that only gush on days with north wind." What if a comedy sat patiently in a jar for 2,000 years and, when unrolled, delivered the same joke about figs and cousins in accents we recognize? What if a manual on automata described a steam bird that sings 9 notes and refuses the 10th? Because even birds have boundaries. Each possibility is a lullaby with footnotes. They do not change our morning. They make the evening more companionable. And then there are the echoes we already live with. A student falls asleep under a lamp that would please a Ptolemaic supervisor, shaded, steady, and not too close to the nearest vulnerable fiber. A librarian teaches how to cradle a brittle spine as if it were elderly pottery. The student practices with a blank notebook because one should not learn on grandparents. An archivist tests glue the way someone else tests soup, with a fingertip and a private face. Somewhere, a maintenance list includes dust behind astronomy, which is funny twice. The city is gone, but the chores remain, which is the gentlest kind of immortality. If you are still awake, I can tell you about a small clay seal impressed with a griffin that once kept a roll closed. The seal bears a fingerprint that is slightly crooked, suggesting the maker was in a hurry to finish being careful. I can tell you about a vellum palimpsest where a hymn hid under a bit of arithmetic like a child under a blanket. I can tell you about a shipping docket that reads, in part, 1 jar alum, 1 jar gum, 2 jars uncertainty, which is either a joke or a scribe's confession. You can sleep on any of these, they are all soft. We do not need to end, we can just lessen. Imagine the wind over the harbor carrying the smell of sea and the sound of rope being persuasive. Imagine a clerk sweeping an empty room because sweeping is how a room knows it is remembered. Imagine the catalog in a form we will never hold, continuing to add names in a careful hand. Things that were, things that might have been, things that were copied on a cool morning when the ink behaved. The lighthouse puts its shoulder against the night, the way lighthouses do, and time, which is usually in a hurry, pauses politely at the door. You might not expect a world-changing library to begin with such a small sound, but many histories start with a scratch of reed on papyrus. A scribe tested a nib, drew a little line, frowned at the angle, turned the reed a fingertip and drew another line. The second line behaved better. Somewhere above him, a king watched a harbor that moved like a crowded thought and imagined a building where all thoughts would dock. It wasn't a thunderclap of destiny. It was the quiet conviction that if you organize enough shelves, the world tidies itself out of sheer politeness. If you're still awake by the time we reach the recipe for humidity-proof paste, feel free to subscribe very gently, the way you would close a scroll with clean hands. The harbor they chose was a collector by nature. Ships arrived smelling of different kitchens, carrying olives in one dialect and philosophy in another. Alexandria had a custom with the cozy audacity of a cat choosing your lap. Visiting texts were barred for copying, with gratitude expressed in the form of keeping the best version. Owners received handsome duplicates for their trouble, which, depending on your temperament, was either a fine compliment or well-dressed theft. The lighthouse oversaw this paperwork with patient light. At night, its beam folded over the water like a bookmark you forgot to remove, passing slowly, then returning as if rereading the same page. Inside, the Mousean planted a long table and called it policy. The scholars slept in rooms that smelled of papyrus, ate in courtyards that smelled of cumin, and spoke in hallways that smelled of ambition politely disguised as curiosity. Doors were ceremonially lockable and practically open. The head librarian wore keys that clinked to remind everyone that chaos was invited only under supervision. When a mathematician slipped past the poets, the building arranged for him to overhear a metaphor and correct it with a diagram. The city believed in planned accidents, the good kind, the sort that leave you accidentally fluent in a new subject by lunchtime. Catalogs were the true architecture. Coimicus gathered the building into books about its books. The Pinakes, which were both table of contents and autobiography. Entries listed titles, authors, incipits, those first hair-combing sentences along with remarks that were not unopinionated. Reading the catalog must have felt like wandering the harbor with someone who points at ships and whispers either "genius aboard" or "bring a sieve." The Pinakes never pretended to be finished. They pretended, very convincingly, to be ongoing. The librarians learned to enjoy that theater, writing supplement to supplement with the cheerful sigh of people who understand that order is a verb. The papyrus itself was river made sensible. Reeds were cut, peeled into pale strips, soaked until they remembered their flexibility, then laid down in a cross-hatched bed like kindling for a tidy fire. Pressed under weight, dried in good air, the sheet acquired the faint sheen of fruit that has considered ripeness and agreed. Soot ink mixed with gum arabic behaved well if the weather did. On humid days it became philosophical. The reed pen the calamus was sharpened with a small knife that resembled honesty. Scribes wrote in columns of measured breath, ending with a little flourish, the coronis, which looked like a bird that had decided to sit down exactly here and nowhere else. Because the text spoke without spaces scriptio continua, the reader's eye learned to hear. The mind inserted gentle separations, like a careful host arranging chairs not too close and not too far. Corrections had their own orchestration. A dipole, a neat wedge, invited attention. The abelos, a modest spear, challenged a suspect line. The antisigma wagged like a professor's finger. Margins gathered a polite snowfall of future opinions. You can imagine a sleepy scholar late at night leaning back to consider whether the line truly requires an abelos, and then deciding the line has suffered enough for 1 century. Acquisitions ran on gossip and sandals. Agents traveled the sea like patient bees, visiting islands and ports, buying private collections politely from widows with elegant opinions about interest rates. Letters went out in courteous bursts. Please send tragedies by the equinox, comedies if cheerful, any medical treatises that mention coriander. We suspect coriander is important. Pergamon collected as energetically as Alexandria, and rivalry blossomed into a story about a papyrus embargo that probably I said true, but is very satisfying. It suggests an economy where plants negotiate politics, which is exactly the kind of economy a library would prefer. Daily life achieved a sleepy momentum. There were cleaning days when scrolls were unrolled for air, dusted with soft cloths, and persuaded not to crack by murmuring nice things at the seams. Rodent Patrol, a pair of cats with excellent resumes, stalked the aisles with unionized dignity. An annual memo recommended placing oil lamps, 2 handspans distant from curiosity, a phrase clearly written by someone who had once rearranged a scorch mark into a metaphor. Pay arrived in jars of grain, comfortingly quantifiable. The ledger line for miscellaneous paste appeared more frequently than anyone could explain, which suggests optimism. The rooms contained people and their endearing precision. Euclid arranged geometry like a set of well-fitted drawers and labeled them elements, so future mathematicians couldn't pretend they lost the instructions. Eratosthenes measured the earth with a stick, a well, and a willingness to read shadows, then invented a job title, Philologos, that would look excellent on a door. Aristophanes described nerves with a patience usually reserved for thread. A poet wrote a hymn to a favorite librarian's habit of whisper walking, which is the kind of office culture we should all strive for. Someone added the first recorded complaint about drafts to the margin of a medical text. This room cures fevers by invitation. Drift now into the galleries of subjects and the treasures they guarded without quite noticing. There were astronomical tables that did not know they were ancestors of phone alarms. There were histories that misremembered dates impressively but still told the truth of people in their favorite shoes. There were recipes for purple dye that smelled like civic pride. Mathematics lounge near music because both speak in ratios. A student fetching a Lyre manual might return with a theorem and not mind the detour. On a winter afternoon, you could imagine the entire building breathing together. All those columns of text, inhaling, exhaling, turning a page. The copy rooms resembled kitchens. Ink simmered in small pots. A clerk stirred with a thoughtful wrist reserved elsewhere for sauces. Reeds soaked in water to soften like dry bread brought back to usefulness. A head scribe tested the line weight on practiced scraps and muttered a blessing or a complaint, hard to distinguish. The going rate was so many drachmae per 100 lines, with an extra fee if your author insisted on compound words with no intention of ever ending. It was honest work, the sort that produces the rare and underrated pleasure of finishing a column at the exact moment your lamp wick needs tending. Rumor insists on arriving early to tragedies, and so our scene shifts slowly to heat. Caesar, fighting his tidy war, burned ships that weren't going to cooperate. Fire is careless with boundaries. Flame licked warehouses with the indiscriminate affection of an untrained puppy. Some say it touched annexes where scrolls waited their turn to be interesting. Others argue the main halls escaped and only the outbuildings suffered. The paperwork is unclear, as paperwork often is during events that prefer flames to penciled clarity. One clerk evacuated a ledger so conscientiously that scholars still know which month the office purchased new reed cutters. From some disasters, only the receipts survive. Generations later, the Serapeum Temple Library. Neighborhood landmarks stood at the hinge where religion and civic pride negotiate their furniture arrangement. Passions ran high, as passions do when statues are involved. The building was damaged or emptied, depending on which eyewitness you choose to trust this evening. If your favorite version has more shouting, that is an aesthetic choice. Later stories propose that a conqueror ordered book rooms burned after measuring the usefulness of the Quran against everything else. A tale neat enough to be suspicious. It sounds exactly like a moral told to children before bedtime. One book is enough, say your prayers, mind your lamp. Between the sparks, the long yawn of neglect did the heavy lifting. Scrolls dislike drama but adore attention, and attention is a budget line. Humidity sneaked into seams. Insects composed their memoirs in the margins. Teachers retired, and the students loved the teachers, but not their handwriting. A librarian died with a combination to a cabinet in his sensible head. A junior assistant misfiled a set of agricultural treatises behind meteorology, and then became a very happy baker in Cyrene, taking with him the only memory of where the wheat chokes were shelved. This is not collapse. This is a city napping too long. Let's unspool back to craft, because that is where the heart rate lowers. The best papyrus, the Carta Hieratica, sat smooth under the hand like a promise. Lower grades behaved like cousins who meant well. Paste was cooked until it held a peak like meringue, an image I did not intend to make you hungry with, but here we are. Storage instructions recommended vertical stacking to spare the edges. Ambitious scholars ignored this in favor of horizontal piles that let them pretend to be furniture designers. Caps kept dust from taking root. On cleaning day, the coronides, those little rusting birds at the ends, looked like an aviary mid-migration. Naturally, librarians argued because debate is the grit that polishes a catalog. One grammarian accused another of assigning too many breathing marks, as if language required an inhaler. A philosopher wrote a marginal complaint regarding the excessive optimism of sailor metaphors and ethical treatises. Someone stole 3 styluses, and a cat found them by sitting on them, which is the cat equivalent of confession. A cheerful thief returned a scroll 2 days late with a note, kept for weather, a reason any librarian would secretly accept. The head of acquisitions maintained that any book with a recipe should be classified under medicine because recipes cure hunger. The medical section grew prodigiously. The city around the shelves acted as custodian. Wind from the sea arranged the courtyard leaves into little arrows pointing toward the lunch hour. The lighthouse kept time for readers who forgot the sky had moons. Dock workers debated whether Euclid could be persuaded to divide a loaf into fair shares that still felt abundant. A poet insisted that abundance is a ratio rather than a quantity. Frankincense wafted through alleys on high days and discovered, to its surprise, that, like the company of ink, Alexandria, like a brilliant child, got bored only by boredom. What did the library hold that we no longer do? Perhaps a manual of fountains arguing that every civic plaza deserves one small and unnecessary trickle to improve public manners. Perhaps a commentary on Hesiod in which the commentator sighs about olives for 4 pages and ends happier. Perhaps a list of comets cited by fishermen who counted with knotted cords and drank something that warmed their opinions. We do not need these things to make breakfast. We only want them to nod at us across time and say, yes, people. Considered the position of the sun before sending letters, and also here is a joke about fig leaves that misbehaves precisely once in every performance, yet the legend keeps working. Modern archives hum like beehives with better signage. Conservators calibrate humidity until the air itself obtains a resume. File names behave like polite citizens of a republic. Backups vote in every election. A barcode is only a very tidy syllabus, the old tag tied to a scroll's end, upgraded to faint beeping. We still argue about shelving. Dewey speaks decimal. Others prefer Library of Congress, a system named as if every book were a witness. When a graduate student learns to cradle a crumbling ledger the way one carries old porcelain, the Mousian raises an eyebrow and approves. Consider the nightly chores that replace grand endings. A team switches the climate control from day to night, which is the modern equivalent of closing shutters against sea damp. Someone logs a task, dust behind astronomy. The stars will not mind. A student copies a line into a notebook and discovers the handwriting improves only when the shoulders forget to try. A guard walks past a glass case where a papyrus fragment lies like a sleeping leaf and whispers, "Stay," a command that works on neither time nor plants, but feels lastingly correct. The building exhales. The city resumes its dream of being a catalog. And if you remain awake, you may choose a small object to keep you company. I suggest a clay seal impressed with a griffin that once closed a roll about coastal winds. Its fingerprint is slightly crooked, suggesting the maker was late for tea. Or a reed pen with a nib cut just a little off-center, which forces letters to lean as if gossiping. Or a scrap where a bored scribe drew a tiny chariot in the margin, the driver holding the reins of nothing in particular. These are not proofs of greatness. They are the stuff of a life that liked to write things down. In this soft accounting, endings are never final. The harbor still imagines ships approaching with bundles of text tied in string. The lighthouse still presses its shoulder against the dark. Somewhere, a catalog continues to add names in a hand we would recognize. Things that were things copied on mornings when the ink behaved, things that escaped through kindness and neglect. If you drift now, the shelves will not mind. They understand that attention, like papyrus, is strongest when allowed to rest between layers. You might not think a kingdom could be founded on the quiet sound of a reed slicing through water, but the Ptolemies like small beginnings. A cut stem lifted from a Nile marsh makes a soft, decisive shake, as if announcing that it intends to become paper by dinner. In the story that librarians tell one another when the lamps are low and the paste has gone tacky, a king stood at a window, watched the harbor move like a bowl of lentils being stirred, and decided that knowledge should be collected with the same patient spoon. He imagined a house for thinking that would be bigger than thinking itself. There were already temples that guarded gods. He wanted rooms that guarded questions. If you read still awake by the time we get to the tariff for scrolls thicker than a man's thumb, feel free to subscribe or just breathe in the pace of it and let that be enough. Alexandria was a city that measured itself by arrivals. Ships came in layered with spice odors and unwashed poetry, with philosophers who preferred not to declare their luggage, with physicians who traveled with charmingly judgmental mortar. The lighthouse rehearsed the same gesture every night, one arm of light sweeping, pausing, sweeping again, like a patient teacher reminding boats which line to write on. Dock clerks learned to read languages without reading them by the posture of their letters. When a freighter carried a trunk of texts, an official politely borrowed them in the name of scholarship, returned a copy good enough to flatter the owner, and filed the originals under the noble heading of civic improvement. The harbor called it policy. Book owners called it, in varying tones, inevitable. Inside the Mauseon, a building that was part palace and part school and part very tidy monastery of curiosity, the day began with the walnuts of routine, teas counted, cats fed, lamps negotiated into behaving. The chief librarian choose your favorite name from the chain of famous ones and imagine. His sandals walk the colonnade with that busy idleness of people who keep an empire of shelves in their heads. Apprentices ground ink until it resembled the night sky captured in a bowl. The dining hall served ideas with the food, which looks better in memory than it tasted. Someone drew up a list of things most often misplaced by mathematicians, which included the concept of scale and also the spoon. The dream needed a skeleton, and so the catalog grew bones. The pine eggs, compiled with the smoothed patience of a beach stone, tried to describe everything without pretending it could end. Titles were entered, authors proposed and corrected like shoes being gently refitted. The first lines copied because first lines are how the mind recognizes old friends from across the street. Notes appeared with the tact of a neighbor who knows when to water your plants and when to avoid eye contact. Probably by so-and-so, one remark might say, which is librarian for "we fought about this at lunch." A rare entry would include a brief avoid, proving that even in reverent places there is room for a kindly raised eyebrow. Scrolls began as plants and never forgot it. Papyrus grew with the confidence of a weed and the elegance of a well-planned fence. Strips were cut from its pith, laid in a transverse bed, then a perpendicular one, brushed with a sort of slurry that sounds unappetizing and yet reliably holds civilizations together. Pressed dried, polished with a rounded shell to coax a slight shine. Each sheet acquired that faint vegetable memory that makes old documents smell like a cupboard you trust. Sheets were joined into rolls long enough to keep both hands busy and the elbows meaningful. A tag at the end, the syllabus, was tied with string so that a person could find, again, what a moment ago was obvious. There is a very specific pleasure in retying a syllabus, and it has not been improved by any modern bookmark. Scribes sharpen reeds with knives gentle as suggestions. The nib mattered. Too narrow, and the letter looked underfed. Too broad, and it looked as though it had second helpings before grace. On humid afternoons, the ink sulked and refused to be itself. On those days, the copyists called the weather a philosopher and blamed it for everything. They wrote and measured columns, their breathing quietly determining the width. Corrections marched in the margin like small, polite soldiers, a dipel to say, "Note this," and a bellows to stab a suspicious line that maybe did not belong. Aristophanes of Byzantium, who had a reputation for being both exact and vaguely amused, sprinkled breathing marks over poetry the way a gardener introduces stepping stones. The poem did not strictly need them, but feet appreciated the root. Acquisitions traveled on rumor and sandal leather. An agent in Rhodes heard that an old tragedian's grandson kept a trunk. A letter sailed after him that said, in the tone of all good promises, that Alexandria would preserve what time had begun to forget. Pergamon, another city with a habit of collecting, smiled winningly and did the same. Someone later told a story that the Ptolemies embargoed papyrus to inconvenience Pergamon into inventing parchment, a tale both elegant and probably untrue. It feels like something a lobbyist would whisper into a symposium to entertain investors. Meanwhile, a woman in Naucratis sold a private stash of medical recipes after deciding she preferred to remember them rather than dust them. The recipes included a cure for sleeplessness that amounted to warm milk and faith. Treasures of thought, when you open them, rarely look theatrical. In one room, a copy of a lost book of Sappho leaned its shoulder to a volume of Hesiod in a way that would have troubled no one if furniture could lean. In another, a table of star risings preserved a pattern of getting up earlier than neighbors. Eratosthenes paced shadows on a summer day and pronounced the earth respectable in circumference. Later, he read a list of people who had annoyed him and titled it On Old Age, which remains relatable. Herbal treatises explained that fennel would make you see farther if not too boiled, and that dill was useful both for digestion and diplomacy. The great thing was not any single scroll, but how they refused to be great alone. There were copying rooms that sounded like kitchens. Pestles tapped out a domestic rhythm while the foreman murmured page numbers in a tone that could have been prayer. Rates were paid per 100 lines, which led to the curious sport of counting while pretending not to count. A tiny committee once decided, after vigorous comparison, that one poet's lines were shorter on average, causing a flurry of ethical questions ending with the conclusion that everyone would be honest and also that longer lines earned slightly more. Wax tablets with trial letters lay around like biscuit tins smelling of smoke. Cats, who had voted early and often, walked the counters with absolute jurisdiction. And then, like weather that takes its time, came heat. Julius Caesar's campaign left the harbor in a mood. Ships burned because people had quarreled about governance, as people will. Flame climbed ropes, and then memory. Later writers disagreed about what exactly the fire touched. Some said only warehouses where texts waited for copying sighed into smoke. Others said the sigh reached further. The librarians of that year, anonymous as all real caretakers, carried ledgers out in both arms the way one carries a sleeping child, which is how we still know that the office bought 10 new stylus blades in the 8th year, and that the cat named Little Bastet had kittens behind mathematics. Centuries shuffled, and the Serapeum, part temple and part bookshelf and part neighborhood, became the place where different groups argued in public about what is appropriate to revere. In one telling, it was pulled down in pieces. In another, it was emptied with the efficiency of a broom. History, which loves a neat paragraph even more than it loves the truth, devised an emperor who ordered the remaining scrolls burned because one book was enough. The story fits together so cleanly that scholars treat it with suspicion, the way you treat a tidy room that claims no one lives in it. Meanwhile, climate did what climate always does when bureaucracy is distracted. It studied how to be everywhere. Insects took a quiet interest in paste. Neglect is the most patient of librarians. It shelves by forgetfulness and catalogs by habit. A scroll stored flat because the shelf was kindly that day will grow a memory of being flat and resent the request to curve again. A junior assistant with fantastic potential misfiled a crate of agricultural treatises behind philosophical meteorology, and then married a baker who believed in salt. People ate very good bread for 30 years while wheat wisdom slept. A new director wrote, with impeccable penmanship, that he intended to reconcile all duplicate copies before spring. He did not. The city's budget stopped balancing in favor of music festivals and lamps for triumphs. Scrolls prefer dry attention to hot festivals. They are not built for spectacle. It helps when the shadows lengthen to return to small certainties. There was a recipe for paste that called for flour, water, and a patience that could be tasted if you licked your finger absent-mindedly. There was a lecture note that read, "Assume the circle would be embarrassed to argue," which is the kind of instruction that makes geometry suddenly manageable. There was a physician's scroll that recommended counting the patient as breaths with one's own until the two sets convened at the same number. This works for nervous readers as well. There was an astronomer's complaint that Dew kept changing the weight of his instruments and that the sky should keep its opinions to itself until morning. Arguments among librarians were the purest form of peace. Should poets be shelved by island of birth or by meter? The island party countered that meters travel badly at sea, and the meter party replied that islands proliferate. A grammarian proposed a new mark for sarcasm, the rarest of all ancient punctuation, and was applauded in jest and then in earnest. An acquisitions officer wrote a memo titled "On the Safe Temperature of Lamps," noting that the phrase "two handspans" varies depending on enthusiasm. A cat brought a small lizard to an afternoon conference. The minutes record that the lizard was thanked for its attendance and released into mathematics. Outside, Alexandria continued to be a city that applauded itself when the sun hit its stones just so. Dockhands argued about hexameters. Perfume sellers calculated exchange rates as if fragrance possessed weight, and it does in the afternoon. A boy who learned his letters on a wax tablet wrote his name too large and was told that he would either be a poet or an official. He chose to become a merchant of lamps and provided excellent light for both. The lighthouse lifted its elbow again and again, polite as a host who never points and always indicates. Evenings smelled faintly of resin. This is exactly the moment when scrolls like to be read. What vanished wasn't only pages. It was the density of a place where questions bumped into each other at hallway corners and apologized with footnotes. Imagine the lost shelf of everyday wisdom, a list of which wines to trust with laundry, a treatise on the moral responsibilities of a good soup, a comedic play about accountants who miscalculate on purpose just to see what happens to the chorus. We have the grand survivors, the famous theorem, the star table that still squares with certain warnings, but the small survivors carry the lullaby. I like to think there was a scroll devoted entirely to how to wrap fragile vessels for travel. It would have been mostly drawings and very patient arrows. The legend that followed did what legends do. It summarized complexity until it looked like a parable. Yet museums today hum with the same household music. Climate control is simply the modern way of saying, please, no damp hands. Barcodes are upgraded silly boy that beep with tiny gratitude. Conservators gather like chefs at stoves, heating adhesives that have very proper names and no intention of explaining themselves. An archivist will cradle a brittle fragment the way one cradles old porcelain, and the room will draw its breath in and then let it out. And you would swear the papyrus becomes half a degree more comfortable under that attention. Night routines remain. A guard checks the locks with the unhurried competence that makes anxiety go stand in the corner. A student practices turning pages from the corner instead of the middle, and although no one is watching, 1,000 librarians are very gently proud. A label is revised to correct a century-old date by the width of a fingernail. Outside, the moon looks exactly the same. Someone brings in a plant and then removes it because humidity is not a pet. The building learns the names of its own switches. If you whisper in those rooms, it is not because whispers are required, but because they suit the materials. There are still acquisitions, though. Now they come as hard drives that pretend to be sleepier than they are, or as boxes of letters from estates that smelled of cedar for 50 years and will smell of cardboard for 50 more. A modern Pinex is called a database, and though it crashes less often than a human nap, it has the same relationship to time. It wants small breaks and gets them. The cataloger typing an abstract for a treatise on fish sauce might be having the best hour of her week. The sentence includes a table of salting times, is love in a professional dialect. A supervisor walks past and says, "Nice work," which is what the ancients meant when they drew a little bird at the end of a chapter. And so the memory of the lost library quietly volunteers to be a schedule rather than a monument. In the mornings, instructions for unrolling are rehearsed. At noon, the light checks the shelves just to say hello. In the afternoon, a child presses a nose to glass and fogs the case and is gently invited to breathe sideways. In the evening, a custodian flicks off a switch with the same care as tying a silly bows. We do not have the scroll that explains exactly how to keep every scroll, but we have the habit of trying, and habits in archives are how eternity practices. If you've drifted somewhere comfortable by now, that is appropriate. The King's old dream was only half about empire and half about bedtime, a place where the mind, given enough shelves and enough little birds drawn at the ends of lines, can lie down. There's always another corridor to wander, another recipe for paste, another argument about breath marks, another harbor with a trunk of papers arriving at the very polite speed of wind. Somewhere a reed is being cut with that soft, decisive shick, and a scribe is drawing a first line that is a little crooked on purpose. For luck, and then a second line straighter for memory, and then a third which you need not stay awake to hear. You might not expect a library to begin with a shopping list that includes olive oil chalk, reed cutters, a measuring cord, and a small cage for an opinionated goose, and yet that is how the earliest notes. Read in a clerk's hand that leans to the right like a shy fisherman. The king had a plan that was less a proclamation and more a household errand. Build a place where the world could be kept tidy, like garments folded by topic. He pointed from his balcony at the harbor, where ships pinched the water with their keels, and said, almost conversationally, that everything those ships knew should be invited to stay for supper. Lamps were ordered along with benches, and a bell that sounded just enough like a bronze ladle against a pot to make everyone remembrance. If you're still awake when we reach the policy for borrowing ink by the thimble, you're welcome to subscribe or just float along while the lighthouse turns its bright arm and the tide practices being patient. The city liked arrivals more than triumphs. Triumphs were noisy and often sticky. Arrivals promised lists. You could tell which islands had sent their boats by the smell alone. Cypriot resin, Rhodian figs, parchment that traveled with the polite gravity of an expensive coat. Customs officers learned the posture of alphabets, greeting a shipment with the same nod, whether the cargo was cinnamon or syllables. The king's men had a gentle trick. They borrowed a trunk of texts as if they were weighing them for import duty, made copies, and returned the twins with compliments and genuine gratitude. This was called policy, and policies are just feelings with good stationery. In the colonnade, workers marked shelf lengths and paces of an unhurried scholar, which is longer than a soldier's stride and shorter than impatience. The first cataloger paced off a room and declared it suitable for serene walking and arguments about vowels. The Mausian was arranged like a home that had learned the alphabet. Rooms for eating, rooms for thinking, rooms for doing both and regretting neither. Cooks salted their stews with commentary. Philosophers salted their commentary with stew. A chalkboard listed the weak-ass lectures with titles that could have doubled as recipes, on mixtures that behave, on numbers that refuse small bowls. Apprentices swished water in clay jugs until the clay tasted like Benial and then stopped. In the mornings, the staff opened the shutters with the dignity of slow birds. Not because birds are dignified, but because they arrive with their own timekeeping. A junior scribe posted a notice advising against using geometry on dining platters. Triangles etched in bread crusts were acceptable, circles and gravy were not. Somewhere a mathematician protested, which was all the triumph anyone required. The building acquired its own habits. A brittle breeze grabbed at the eaves at the same hour each day, rehearsing for a storm that never came. A bell ringer with tender riffs learned the exact pressure that signaled meeting, as opposed to soup, an error made exactly twice. A line of small holes chiseled into the stone at the entrance measured the widths of sandals. The librarian explained that the door should never know more leather than necessary. In a corner stood a chest of lost objects, 6 styluses, a pair of reed-cutting knives, a little marble rooster, and once a shoe whose owner, according to the note, left contented and will not return, having decided to study silence. It was a cheerful place to misplace your tools. The goose, when she had opinions, was escorted firmly but kindly back to the courtyard. Papyrus was the library's favorite plant. Not due to temperament, papyrus is unapologetically marshy, but because it forgives mistakes. Strips peeled from the inner pith were laid in neat rows like careful hair, then crossed with more strips, a weaving that required a pulse and rewarded a pause. Paste made from flour, water, and a quiet lecture on virtue went between the layers. Presses did the work of patience. When the sheets dried, a shell polished them to a modest shine, the kind you notice only when the lamp sits at the right angle. The sheets joined hands in a roll. The join was called the colossus, and there was modest pride in hiding it so well that even a fussy editor had to lick a finger to find it. At the end dangled a little tag, the syllabos, that told you what you were holding without making a speech. It was the ancient cousin of the modern tab, although the syllabos never crashed. Scribes learned to read with their ears. They trimmed reeds with the tenderness of gardeners pruning roses, aiming for a nib that felt like deliberate rain. Too wet and the letters sprawled like cats. Too dry and they broke into polite coughs. Ink was what happened when lampblack decided to be useful. It had the faint perfume of last night's ideas. On warm days, the bottle grew sulky, and the head scribe added a drop of vinegar, which the ink accepted as discipline. Lines kept time with breath. A scribe wrote until an exhale ended, drew a space, and began again, making prose into a sort of quiet rowing. Corrections were symbols like small hats. A dipel for notice this, an obelus like a skewer for dubious lines, an asterisk for we will argue about this at lunch. There were days when a poem improved in the margin by accident. Acquisitions were a social sport. An envoy in Athens secured the official copies of the tragedies with the sort of smile that moves furniture. In return, he left fair copies that were fairer than fair and stamped with a seal that hissed when cooled. A very satisfying sound. In Rhodes, news arrived of a chest of early medical treatises wrapped in linen that had become opinionated. 2 writers set out with string, wax, and 7 flavors of persuasion. Pergamon, meanwhile, began to collect parchment with affectionate rigor. A rumor whispered that Alexandria throttled the papyrus trade to annoy its rival. But this feels like the kind of tale a dinner guest tells when the olives are gone and the host looks too content. The truth was plainer and duller. Marches fluctuate, budgets sulk, and scribes need reads more than feuds. The library made languages shake hands. In one room, a bilingual list of fish argued gently with itself about whether mullet tasted better roasted or steamed. The Syriac column suggested a sauce that the Greek column agreed to try next week. Glossaries grew like hedges around difficult texts. A lexicographer named his notebooks after winds to remember how quickly words can change direction. Boreas was for legal terms that arrived with storm faces, notice for vocabulary that smelled like kitchens. In a ledger, someone lamented the plague of titles beginning with on, a form favored by authors who suspected their books would be shelved next to famous neighbors. On the nature of onness, a wit proposed under his breath, and was put in charge of labeling jars. Daily life produced its own heroic trivialities. A posted schedule promised the hour of dusting, which often became 2 hours because dust enjoys compliments. Rates for copywork were revised, pay per 100 lines, unless the poet liked long lines, in which case a compromise was reached involving raisins. A policy for candle placement used the unit, the span of a cautious hand, which changed depending on who had burned fingers most recently. There was a fine for leaving a lamp unattended, 3 figs and an apology. House cats patrolled the corridors with civil service attitudes. The ledger notes that a librarian named Pedicirus, having found a mouse in the astronomical indices, assigned the cat to astronomy with a promotion. This arrangement suited everybody except the mice. And yet heat visits every city that stacks wood near ideas. During Caesar's season, flames carried a timber from ship to warehouse and argued loudly with the wind. Later, accounts cannot agree on what burned, which is how you know memory is telling the truth about its confusion. Some say bundles of texts waiting for copying sighed into smoke and returned to their marsh ancestry. Others, more dramatic, must light half the city to keep their sentences warm. The useful details are small. A clerk recorded that 10 new sponges were requisitioned afterward. To wipe soot from ledgers, a boatman swore he saw a cataloger cradle a scroll case as if it were a child fallen asleep in a doorway. Someone worried about the geese, and the geese, contrary to rumor, were fine. Event follows event the way dust follows sandals. The Serapeum's shelves met the politics of manners sometime later. The surviving descriptions are composed in the tidy hand of partisans, which is another way of saying they may be accurate and still not quite right. In one version, zeal and broomsticks cleared the columns as thoroughly as a spring storm cleans a courtyard. In another, the shelves remained, but the attention wandered away, which is the more dangerous weather. A director with grand tiding plans fell ill, then improved, then wrote long memoranda that nobody answered. Copies did what copies do when climate and economics conspire. They leaned, they softened, they asked for a dry afternoon, and were given a parade instead. Neglect sounds like nothing, which is why it is so talented. Vorms that were not vorms, but discreet beetles found paste and spoke well of it to their cousins. A little water arrived most years in the form of air that refused to be honest. It sat on papyrus and sank in, as if conversation had become humidity. A new official decided the catalog could be simplified, then discovered simplification is an elaborate art, and quietly went back to counting keys. Someone stored duplicates in a room with a generous view of the sea, because everyone likes a view. The sea, with its famous patience, visited at night and tasted the bottom shelf. In the ledger for that week, someone drew a very small boat with an apologetic sail. There must have been repairs. A mason reset a threshold and added a slope so carts would stop muttering. A conservator boiled wheat paste with such steady attention you'd think it was a family member. The smell of cedar found its way into boxes. Cedar disagrees with insects in a manner all parties understand. Scholars were asked to blow gently across a page before turning it, and they did, and the pages believed them. The library learned to prize winter. Copyists slept in summer and woke in a season when the air minded its own business. In the margins of winter books, you sometimes find little suns, perhaps to remind the reader that cold is the honest fee for clarity. There is a genre of lostness that doesn't need flames. It's the vanishing of minor things that held the key to major questions. A map of winds drawn by a sailor who mislabeled north for the pleasure of being corrected. A cookbook for Sylphium with a warning to purchase only from merchants who measure with their eyes closed. A play about accountants that required 40 men to pretend to be balances and one to play the ledger, which took great dignity. A letter from a midwife noting which lullabies work on which streets, because every neighborhood keeps its own tempo. None of these would have made us immortal, but each would have made the afternoon more accurate. What remains is the habit of trying again. When evening comes, modern archives perform rituals that the old house would recognize. Temperature and humidity do their slow dance within polite limits. Instruments sigh when the door opens rudely. Silica gel, the quietest of cats, naps in display cases and wakes only to change color in the manner of trustworthy friends. Gloves are sometimes worn and sometimes not, depending on whether the hands are more dangerous than the gloves. Either way, there is a basin for washing and a towel that would have enjoyed the company of philosophers. The staff notes that light is both necessary and rude. They let it in, then show it out, with the care of a host who knows when conversation has turned into repetition. The modern catalog is a chorus of agreeable noises. A barcode beeps like a respectful bird. A file name learns to contain its own metadata the way a scroll learned to wear its silly bows. When a scanner passes across a fragile page, the little motor hums with the optimism of apprentices. It is the sound an old library would have made if it had owned electricity and an easy conscience. Conservation labs keep test logs, which read like weather diaries written by very diplomatic detectives. One adult museum beetle observed, escorted out, did not leave forwarding address. Taste has the same recipe as before, except today it owns a monograph and a recommended stirring speed. In the reading room, a visitor coughs and then apologizes to an era. A scholar registers to see scraps of papyrus that look like brown leaves that survived a particular literate autumn. The docent speaks softly about fibers and joins, as if the sheets can hear their own history and will respond better to compliment than to command. Someone examines a fragment whose letters talk about figs and unexpectedly wants figs. Another person falls asleep over a photostat and wakes gently to find a bookmark placed on their chest by a librarian whose superpower is mercy. Security cameras blink. 1,000 cats of electricity patrol the corridors and keep the mice of disorganization modest. There are, of course, what-ifs, but they are the kind that make bed feel sturdier instead of thinner. What if a certain astronomer's notebook had allowed us to skip a few centuries of arguing about ellipses? We would still have argued because humans like to set time aside for disagreement, and that is sometimes how clarity finds a chair. What if a secular hymn book had survived that taught a tune designed to be hummed while dusting shelves? We could hum another. The rhythm of dusting is remarkably similar across cultures. What if there had been a compendium titled How Not to Panic, with a preface by a cook and a postscript by a mathematician? Perhaps it exists in the shape of 1,000 notes and 1,000 margins that all say, in their way, keep going. The echo of the vanished house is not a tragedy so much as a tempo. It tells us to walk with slow ankles, to correct with kindness, to sharpen the reed with the expectation that it will grow dull again. It reminds us that copying is not merely repetition, but a way of breathing. Inhale the line, exhale the space, begin again. You can practice this with your own thoughts, which are very good pages if treated gently. If you are cataloging your day, write the first line slowly, leave room for a gloss in the margin, And if you draw an asterisk near the nicest part, you can label your keys, you can count your lamps. You can decide to put the warm things toward the top shelf where reaching stretches the back in a grateful way. At night, the buildings sleep the way shelves sleep, upright, persuaded by gravity, in agreement with their beams. Somewhere a conservator finishes washing a brush and lines it up with its siblings like reeds thinly disguised as horses. Somewhere a security guard clicks a lock with the same attention a scribe once gave to not blotting. Somewhere a reader bows to a case and says nothing, and the nothing is the right answer. The sea practices its soft arithmetic against the harbor stones. The lighthouse raises its long arm one more time, pointing not at anything in particular, but at the general direction of safety, which is also the general direction of morning. If you're still with me, we have reached the part where the silence does most of the work. A reed waits beside a knife. A pot of paste cools to the exact temperature of trust. The goose who has opinions is sleep. The catalog sits very still, having learned that stillness is a useful entry. A person in a distant room turns a page with 2 fingers as instructed, and the sound is the faintest recipe. Somewhere, a little tag flutters at the end of a roll and says what it has always said. Here I am. Here also is the beginning. And if your eyelids decide to shelve the room for later the library, we'll agree and keep the lamp low and keep the list open and wait with the patience of paper for you to come back when the morning is ready.